22 years after his daughter vanished, a father opens her yearbook, and everything starts to unravel. You'd think, after 22 years, the dust would have settled on the furniture, the floorboards, the grief. But sometimes, dust just waits. So does memory. So does guilt. Graham Porter stood motionless at the doorway of the room he hadn't entered since 1990. His hand rested on the frame as if afraid the slightest push would send the whole house crumbling. Outside, Mornington's signature mist swept in from the Pacific, brushing over the lighthouse like a ghost retracing old paths. The sea was out there, past the cliffs and through the fog, unchanged, just like this room. Inside, time had frozen, not in some romanticized, picture-perfect way. No, it was raw, honest, unmoving. A high school poster curled at the edge still clung to the wall, like it had the day Isabel had taped it there. Her desk was meticulously arranged, books stacked by size, a half-used notepad with neat bullet points, a pen set sideways like she'd planned to return to it after dinner. Her closet door stood ajar, revealing faded denim jackets, dresses with shoulder pads, and a pair of white Reeboks that had yellowed with time. Graham took a step in. The floor creaked, low and hesitant. His breath caught in his chest. "She's not coming back," he whispered aloud, not as a statement, but as if testing the words against the silence. They sounded unreal even to him. Last night, Judith had said it again. Maybe for the 100th time. It was time to move on, time to let go, time to make space. But what does that even mean when your child never came home? They had agreed, finally, that today would be the day they sorted Isabel's belongings, some for charity, some for storage. "We'll keep the meaningful things," Judith had said, voice brittle but steady. "We'll choose together." But she wasn't here now. Just Graham. Just the stillness. He walked toward the window and opened it. Dust stirred instantly, catching the light in suspended dance. The room sighed. It was the first breath it had taken in decades. He turned to the closet. Isabel had loved that prom dress. She hated the corsage, though, said it made her look like a walking bouquet. He smiled weakly, the smile of a man remembering and unraveling at the same time. Slowly, methodically, he began folding clothes. Blue sweater, prom dress, patched jeans she insisted on fixing herself. Every item brought back a sliver of her voice, her scent, her stubbornness. And then he found the yearbook. It was at the bottom of a box of textbooks, glossy, heavier than he remembered. Graham paused. He had never opened it, not once. After Isabel vanished, neither he nor Judith could bear to look at that face. Her bright, future-filled smile, frozen on a page, surrounded by classmates who went on with their lives, while hers was suspended in nothingness. He sat on the edge of the bed and placed the yearbook on his lap. His fingers hovered over the cover for a long second before he opened it. Her senior photo appeared a few pages in, and there she was, Isabel Porter, class of 1990, brown hair feathered into waves, a hint of eyeliner, and that smile, warm, confident, just a touch rebellious. The kind of smile that says, "I've got plans, and you can't stop me." Graham ran his hand gently across the page. His throat tightened. 22 years, sweetheart," he murmured, "and I still don't know how to hold you in my heart without pain." Next to her photo was another girl's. Amy? No, wait, that wasn't right. He squinted. Marianne Bell. That's the name, her best friend. The one who used to sleep over every Friday night, who called Graham Mr. P and always brought sour gummies for Isabel. He hadn't thought of her in years, and yet here she was, smiling beside Isabel, locked forever in a moment they didn't know would be their last together. He turned the page to Isabel's profile. Beneath her quote and acknowledgments, he read, "Thanks to Mom and Dad for always believing in me, to my teachers, who made me better, and to my best friend, Marianne. Don't forget to return the secret garden. Illustrated edition, you old grandma. Love you forever." Graham blinked. The Secret Garden. That had been Isabel's favorite book when she was a kid. She'd collected versions of it, like some girls collected dolls. First edition, paperbacks, the ones with pop-up scenes. But he didn't remember an illustrated version, and certainly not one loaned to a friend. He stood up, scanning the books he had already boxed. None of them were it. His curiosity stirred, tinged with something else. Urgency. He flipped to the back of the yearbook, where students had scribbled addresses and phone numbers, and there it was, Marianne Bell. Next to it, in curly handwriting, "Call me anytime, BFF." Graham felt foolish even trying, but he pulled out his phone and dialed. Disconnected. Of course, it had been 2 decades. Behind him, the front door opened. Judith walked in with grocery bags, stopping mid-step when she saw the mess. Books and clothes laid out. Dust dancing in the sunbeams. "Graham?" Her voice was tight. "What are you doing?" "I started sorting." "Like we said," he replied. "We agreed we'd do it together. You're not supposed to scatter her things all over the house." He hesitated, holding up the yearbook. "I found this," he said quietly. "She wrote something about a book, one Marianne borrowed. I was just trying to find it." "A book?" Judith scoffed. "After all this time? You think it matters?" Graham met her gaze. I don't know. I guess I want to know if someone still has something of hers." Judith set the bags down and crossed her arms. "I saw Marianne a few months ago," she said. "She lives in a camper outside town, keeps to herself." Graham nodded slowly. "Maybe I'll visit her." "You do what you want," she said, her voice flat. "I'll finish what we started." He packed the yearbook, his wallet, and phone. As he stepped toward the door, he paused, watching Judith kneel and begin folding Isabel's clothes. He wanted to stay, to hold his wife, to help shoulder the grief they never quite shared the same way. But something else pulled at him, something unspoken, something that began the moment he read that line in Isabel's handwriting. It wasn't about a book anymore. It was about a voice, one that had waited 22 years to be heard. Would she still be there? Would she even remember? Graham didn't know, but he was already reaching for the car keys. The road out of Mornington curved like memory, quiet, winding, reluctant to reveal what came next. Pines flanked the highway, their tall spines blurred by the morning fog that still clung low to the earth, as if even the forest held its breath. Graham drove without music. The only sound was the soft hum of tires on damp asphalt and the occasional creak of his old sedan's suspension. The yearbook sat on the passenger seat belted in like a fragile guest. Every few miles, his eyes drifted to it, not to open, but just to reassure himself that it was still there. He hadn't thought about Marianne Bell in years. After Isabel disappeared, Marianne had come by the house often. She'd sat on their porch, cried with Judith, brought drawings Isabel had left behind in her locker. But then, like most people, she eventually stopped coming. Grief has a half-life, and for some, it burns out faster than others. Judith had said Marianne was still in town, living in a camper. Keeps to herself now, she'd said, as if that explained everything. Graham hadn't asked more. He didn't want to. He just wanted to see her face again, to see what time had done to someone who once knew Isabel better than anyone. The camper lot sat near the edge of a clearing, just past the outermost gas station. Graham pulled in slowly, scanning the mismatched row of trailers, some rusted, some adorned with flower pots or makeshift porches. He stepped out and asked a man sweeping leaves near a silver RV. "Marianne Bell?" Graham asked. The man nodded, pointing toward a blue and white camper at the far end. "That one. Nice gal. Bit quiet. Keeps to herself." Graham approached with measured steps, unsure if he was ready for what this meeting might stir. He knocked. Once, twice. The door creaked open a moment later, and there she was. Marianne Bell. Her blonde hair was now streaked with soft gray, tied back in a loose bun. Lines traced the edges of her eyes, but they didn't dull her expression. They deepened it. She looked at him with polite confusion, a stranger evaluating a silhouette from another life. "Yes," she said, voice gentle but guarded. "It's Graham," he replied, his own voice softer than he intended. "Graham Porter, Isabel's father." There was a beat. Then her face shifted, recognition cracking through the years like morning light through a storm cloud. Her eyes shimmered, and she stepped back without a word, opening the door wider. "Please," she said, her voice catching. "Come in." The camper smelled faintly of cinnamon and old paperbacks. It was tidy, lived in. Graham took a seat on the small bench seat by a table, while Marianne busied herself with a kettle. "I wasn't expecting," she began, then paused. "It's been so long." "I know," he said quietly. "I'm sorry to just show up." "No, it's okay," she said, placing 2 mugs of coffee between them. "Honestly, I've thought about you and Judith so many times." Graham nodded, unsure how to begin. He reached into his coat and pulled out the yearbook, setting it on the table between them. Marianne's eyes widened. "I found it yesterday," he explained, "while going through Isabel's room. I never opened it before." Her hand trembled slightly as she touched the worn cover. "She loved this thing," Marianne whispered. Graham opened it to Isabel's page and pointed to the note. Marianne leaned in, reading silently, then let out a small, breathy laugh, half joy, half ache. "She always called me old grandma because I forgot everything," Marianne said, shaking her head. "Especially books." Graham looked at her. "Did you ever return it? The secret garden?" Her smile faded into something softer, almost shy. She stood, moved to a cabinet beneath her bed, and opened a wooden box. A few moments later, she pulled out a worn, cloth-bound book, the illustrated edition. "I never did," she said. "I kept forgetting. Then, after everything happened, I couldn't let it go." She cradled it in her hands like it was made of glass. "Would you mind terribly if I kept it?" she asked, eyes wet. "It's the last thing I have of her." "Of course," Graham said. "Of course you can." She passed the book to him so he could look. He opened it slowly, flipping through its pages. Each one yellowed with age, but still rich in color. A small piece of paper slipped out from the middle. He picked it up. It was a torn page from a youth fashion magazine. A photo of a teenage boy, dark hair, confident smirk, dressed in 90s streetwear. It was familiar, in a strange way. "Who's this?" Graham asked, holding it up. Marianne leaned in. "That's Julian Reddick. He was in our class, modeled a bit, ended up starting a clothing brand later." Graham flipped back through the yearbook until he found Julian's profile. The same face, slightly younger, still smug. "I remember Judith once mentioned you dated him," Graham said casually. Marianne laughed. Short. Surprised. "What? No, never. I didn't even like him. Isabel did, for a while." Graham's head snapped up. "She never mentioned him." "It was, complicated," Marianne said, fidgeting with her coffee mug. "Junior year. He had a thing for her. It didn't last. We both saw through him pretty fast. But she always saw good in people. She used to ask me the strangest questions about him. Like, whether I thought someone like Julian could really change." Graham leaned forward. "Did the police know? When she disappeared?" "I told them," Marianne said. "Everyone in our class was questioned, but at that point, she was already dating Brandon Knox. Remember him?" Graham nodded slowly. "He came to the house a few times. They focused on him. He was the obvious suspect," Marianne said, "but he had an alibi. Julian kind of disappeared into the background." Graham stared at the magazine clipping again. Why would Isabel use his page as a bookmark? "I remember that day," Marianne said quietly. "She tore it out while I was reading that issue. Said it was all he was good for, a bookmark." Graham nodded, mind racing. "Do you know where Julian is now?" Marianne pulled out her phone. "There was a high school reunion last weekend. I didn't go. But they had it at his house. Someone posted the address in our alumni group chat." She found the message and passed him the phone. Graham quickly copied it down. "Do you think he was involved?" Marianne asked softly. "I don't know," Graham said. "But the fact that Judith and I never knew he existed, and you did, means he was someone she didn't want us to know about." He stood, gently returning the book. "Thank you," he said. "And, for keeping that piece of her." Marianne touched his arm as he turned to leave. "Tell Judith I'm sorry," she said, "and thank you for letting me remember her." Outside, the fog had begun to lift slightly, revealing the faint shimmer of sun on wet leaves. Graham got into his car, Julian's address glowing from his phone screen, and sat in silence for a long moment. Somewhere, deep inside, he knew he hadn't opened a yearbook yesterday. He'd opened something else. Something far older. Something that was never meant to stay buried. The address glowed faintly on Graham's phone as he steered the car along Mornington's winding coastal road. It led him past places he hadn't visited in years. An old bait shop shuttered now, the diner where Isabel used to beg for pancakes after swim meets, and the bluff she loved most, where she'd once told him the sea felt like it was breathing. 22 years had passed since she vanished, and yet every turn in this town still echoed her name. Julian Reddick lived in the kind of neighborhood that didn't need to announce its wealth. The houses weren't flashy, but they sprawled. Iron gates, circular driveways, lawns that had never known dandelions. It was the kind of place where people answered doors in golf polos and didn't ask how you were, just why you were there. Graham parked across the street from the address Marianne had given him. The house was a clean-lined, two-story coastal modern, its white exterior framed by dark wood beams and large glass panels that caught the overcast light. He didn't move for a moment. He sat there in the car, palms resting on the steering wheel, breathing through a knot in his chest. It wasn't fear, not exactly. It was something colder. He was trespassing, not on land, but on a life that had gone on, thrived even, while his had stood still. Across the driveway, the front door opened. A man stepped out, walking alongside a younger woman in athletic wear. They laughed softly, casually. Then he kissed her cheek, watched her drive off, and turned back toward the house. Graham recognized him immediately. Julian Reddick had the kind of face that didn't disappear. Thicker now, older, but still handsome in that effortless, curated way. His walk was confident, his hair perfectly placed. He looked like the kind of man who knew the world bent for him, just slightly, without needing to be asked. And then his eyes landed on Graham's car. It was brief, just a flicker of recognition, a shadow of suspicion, but it was enough. Graham exhaled, unbuckled, and stepped out. "Good afternoon," he said, raising a hand. "Julian Reddick, right?" Julian stopped near the edge of his front walk. "Who's asking?" "I'm Graham Porter," he said, "Isabel Porter's father." Something changed in Julian's face. The jaw tightened, the smile faltered. "What do you want?" he said flatly. "I just have a few questions," Graham replied, "about Isabel. You two went to school together." Julian didn't answer. He just stared, unreadable. "I'm not here to accuse you of anything," Graham continued. "I just found a clipping with your photo inside a book Isabel left behind. Thought maybe you could tell me more about how you knew each other." "I barely did," Julian said, arms crossing. "We weren't friends. We didn't date. I told the police all that, back when it happened. I don't see why I have to repeat myself after 22 years. Graham nodded slowly, absorbing the defensiveness in every syllable. "Funny thing is," he said quietly, "you showed up in a book that meant a lot to her. And when I spoke to Marianne Bell, she remembered you too." Julian's jaw flexed. "She didn't even come to the reunion." "I didn't say she did." There was silence, a thick one. "I'm not trying to ruin your Sunday," Graham said gently. "I just never knew you were part of Isabel's life. Not until now." Julian scoffed. "I wasn't." "Then why are you so tense?" "I'm not tense," Julian snapped. "I just don't like strangers watching my house." Graham took a step forward, but not threateningly. "I'm not a stranger. I'm a father. One who's still trying to understand what happened to his daughter." "She was dating someone else," Julian said. "That guy, Brandon. He was the one they looked at, right?" "He had an alibi," Graham said softly. "Well, it wasn't me." "I never said it was." Julian's eyes narrowed. "Then what exactly are you implying?" "I'm not implying anything. I'm asking." He paused. "Why would she hide you from us?" Julian shook his head. "People hide all kinds of things, Mr. Porter. Doesn't mean there's a story behind every shadow." "Maybe not," Graham said, "but some shadows move." Julian's shoulders rose with a frustrated breath. "Look, I've built a life, a business, a reputation. I don't need ghosts from high school showing up on my doorstep." "I understand," Graham said, "but you're the first person I've spoken to who got angry just hearing her name." Julian turned, walking back toward the house. "You should leave," he said over his shoulder. "There's nothing else I can tell you about Isabel Porter." Graham stood there, watching the door close behind him. He didn't move. Not yet. He stared at the house, trying to memorize every detail. Why had Julian reacted like that? If there was nothing to hide, why the hostility? Why the panic flickering beneath that polished exterior? It didn't feel like grief. It felt like fear. Eventually, Graham walked back to his car. He slid into the seat and stared straight ahead. His hands trembled slightly, not from confrontation, but from clarity. Something wasn't right. He should have gone home. Judith was waiting. She was probably already boxing books and clothes alone. He had promised to help, to let go, to move forward. But he couldn't. Not now. Not with this new thread pulled loose. He turned the key. The engine rumbled to life. There was one more place he needed to see. Julian had said he had nothing to hide, but Graham had seen something in his eyes. The flicker of a name not yet buried. The coastal road unspooled beneath Graham's tires like a path etched by memory itself. Winding, narrow, and bordered by cliffs that dropped off into a gray, endless sea. The sun had dipped low, casting everything in the quiet gold of late afternoon. Shadows stretched long across the pavement, as if time itself were slowing to a hush. The address Marianne had shared led him beyond the usual neighborhoods, past the familiar limits of Mornington. Trees thickened, cell signal faded. Graham's knuckles whitened around the steering wheel. He wasn't exactly sure what he was doing. He had no search warrant, no appointment, no one beside him. Only a name, a feeling, and a thread that refused to let him go. He passed a weathered wooden sign. Whitlow Cliff, private access. The driveway it marked was overgrown, barely visible, but the tire tracks were fresh. He pulled to a stop just out of sight, tucked behind a bend in the road, where the trees leaned in like old eavesdroppers. The ocean rumbled beyond the cliffs, a low and steady hush that pressed against everything. Through the pines, he spotted the cottage. It sat low against the hill, a modest one-story with gray shingles and white trim. Picturesque, almost too perfect. A black SUV was parked in the gravel drive. No movement, no sound. Until suddenly, the door opened. Julian stepped out. Graham ducked low in his seat. He watched as Julian walked to the SUV, opened the trunk, and retrieved a few items: a shovel, a jug of water, a long wooden box, and a bouquet of white flowers. White hyacinths. Graham's breath caught. The flowers. He hadn't thought of them in years. But Judith would always bring them on Isabel's birthday. They were her favorite. He sat frozen as Julian placed the items in a small trolley and began walking down a narrow footpath behind the house, toward the cliffs. Graham hesitated only a second longer, then slowly opened his door. The air smelled of salt and pine and something else, something old and buried. He followed, careful to stay low, far enough behind not to be seen, but close enough not to lose sight. The trail wound past scrubby bushes and wind-blown trees. The sound of the ocean grew louder with every step, until suddenly it opened up to a clearing. An overlook hanging high above the sea, raw and dramatic. The sun lit the waves in fractured gold as they crashed against the rocks far below. Julian stood near the edge. Graham crouched behind a cluster of boulders, heart pounding. Julian looked around carefully, then began digging. The soil was rocky, stubborn. He grunted with each stroke. Sweat gathered at his brow. After several minutes, he paused, wiped his face, then opened the wooden box. Graham couldn't see what was inside, but he saw Julian pause and stare into it for a long moment, his lips moving soundlessly, like someone murmuring to a ghost. Then a sudden gust of wind blew across the bluff. Julian cursed as a few pages from the box lifted into the air, fluttering like birds. He scrambled after them, grabbing what he could. Once gathered, he carefully placed the bundle back into the box, added the bouquet of white hyacinths on top, and began to cover it all with soil. He packed the dirt tightly, poured water over the mound, and stepped back. For a long time, he stood there, staring at the freshly turned earth. And then, in a voice just loud enough to carry over the waves, he whispered, "I think you can hold these memories now, Isabel." The name hit Graham like a brick. He recoiled slightly, his heel slipping on a patch of gravel. The sound was barely more than a crunch, but Julian heard it. His head snapped toward the trees. "Hello?" he called out, sharp and tense. "Is someone there?" Graham froze. He pressed himself against a tree trunk, barely daring to breathe. His heart thudded like a drum inside his ribs. Julian took a few cautious steps forward, shovel still in hand. He stopped just a few feet away, listening. The wind rustled the bushes. A crow called out in the distance. Julian scanned the trees, then muttered, "Just the wind," though he didn't sound convinced. He turned and began walking the perimeter of the clearing, checking behind rocks, glancing back at the house as if someone might be watching from there too. Finally, seemingly satisfied, he was alone. He returned to the cottage. He leaned the shovel against the side of the house, loaded the empty trolley into his SUV, and drove off. Graham stayed hidden for a full 5 minutes. Then he stood. His knees trembled, his breath shook. He made his way to the freshly packed mound of soil, heart thudding in rhythm with the waves below. He didn't know what was in that box, but he knew what wasn't. Truth. And truth was what he had come for. Slowly, he walked back to the cottage and retrieved the shovel Julian had left behind. Then he returned to the mound and began to dig. The soil was still damp, easy to move. He worked carefully, silently, until he reached the flowers. He set them aside, and just as the tip of the shovel struck the box, he heard a voice behind him. "I knew someone was out there," it said, low and tight. I was right. Graham spun around. Julian stood there, eyes burning, rage flaring beneath his carefully kept composure. He took a step forward. "You shouldn't have come back here." "What's in the box, Julian?" Graham asked, voice shaking but clear. "Why did you say her name?" Julian's hands clenched. "You don't know what you're doing." "I know enough," Graham said, lifting the shovel slightly, not as a threat, but as a symbol. "I heard you. I saw you bury it." Julian stepped closer, pulling something from his coat. A gun. "Drop it," he ordered. Graham froze. The metal glinted in the fading sun. "I just want to know," Graham said. "Just tell me what you buried." Put the shovel down, Julian said again, louder. Graham slowly raised his free hand. Then, with the other, he reached into his pocket and pulled out his phone. I'm calling the police, he said. You can shoot me if you want. But they'll come. They'll know. Julian's expression shifted. Panic crept in. With sudden speed, he lunged forward and slapped the phone from Graham's hand. It skidded across the rocks, straight toward the edge of the cliff. No! Graham shouted, diving after it. Just before it fell, his fingers closed around it. He hit the SOS button. The chime was faint, but it was enough. Julian's face contorted. You don't understand, he screamed. You never knew her like I did. Then tell me, Graham shouted back. What happened to her? What did you do? Julian's hands shook. The gun quivered in his grip. She left me no choice. She said she loved me, and then she walked away. Isabel was 17, Graham said, voice breaking. She didn't owe you anything. She trusted you. And you? She betrayed me, Julian screamed. And then, sirens, in the distance, climbing the road, wailing, closer. Julian turned toward the sound, eyes wide, chest heaving. He looked back at Graham, torn between fury and fear. The gun lowered, then he dropped it, raised his hands. By the time the first squad car pulled into view, Graham had sunk to his knees, trembling. Dirt on his palms, salt in his mouth. But he wasn't afraid anymore. Because somewhere in that wooden box, beneath the soil, beneath the lies, was the voice of a daughter who had waited 22 years to be heard. The police cordoned off the bluff with crime scene tape that snapped in the sea wind. Blue and red lights pulsed faintly against the pine trees as officers moved with purposeful urgency, some fanning out through the woods, others gathering evidence around the disturbed earth. Paramedics checked Graham for bruises and blood pressure, but he waved them off, barely hearing their questions. He stood silently, arms folded across his chest, watching as Detective Ramirez approached. Late 40s, steady voice, no nonsense in her eyes. I'm Detective Ramirez. You must be Mr. Porter, she said, firm but not unkind. Graham nodded. You said he buried something here, and mentioned your daughter's name? Yes, he rasped. Isabel. He said she could hold the memories now, like she was listening. Ramirez looked toward the mound of dirt. She motioned to the forensic team. Let's see what's in it. The process felt excruciatingly slow, though it was probably just minutes. Graham stood rooted, every muscle taut, as if any motion might unravel what was left of him. When the box finally emerged, wooden, old-fashioned, the kind someone might store family heirlooms in, it was set gently on a tarp. Ramirez crouched beside it, gloved, cautious. She opened the lid. The first thing they saw was the bouquet of white hyacinths, now slightly crushed, but still fragrant. Beneath them, layers of papers, yellowed letters, folded notes, printouts of emails or texts, photographs, and something else. A small woolen doll, hand-stitched, with mismatched button eyes and a frayed ribbon around its waist. Graham's knees nearly buckled. That was hers, he whispered. She made it in 5th grade, called it Little Ruthie. She wouldn't sleep without it. Ramirez met his gaze. Would you prefer to step away? No, he said. I need to know. I've waited 22 years to know. She nodded, then turned to the team. Start cataloging, carefully. They worked in silence, laying each item on clean cloth. The letters were dated, some handwritten, some typed. Many signed J or yours forever. J, others bore Isabel's handwriting, frantic, pleading, forgiving. One read, I know you're hurting, but you can't keep pulling me back when I'm trying to move forward. Another, I still believe in you, but I'm scared. Please let me breathe. The messages weren't just love letters. They were maps of manipulation, emotional traps disguised as apologies. Julian had written her into a world where he was both savior and storm. A few of the printouts made Ramirez's face harden. She handed one to a nearby officer, her tone clipped. Get these into evidence immediately. What is it? Graham asked. She hesitated, then gently, text messages. From the weeks before she disappeared. It appears Julian and Isabel had a secret relationship that escalated. She tried to end it. He didn't take it well. But why didn't she tell us? Graham asked, his voice cracking. Why wouldn't she come to us? Ramirez looked at him, and for the first time her voice softened. Because she was 17, and she believed she could fix someone. Graham turned away, blinking rapidly. He looked toward the cliff, toward the ocean. Isabel had always believed people could be better, because she saw the good first, even when it cost her. Another officer called out, holding a small cassette tape recorder, bagged and labeled. Ramirez held it up. We'll try to restore the audio, she said. Could be important. A moment later, a young technician held up a series of photographs found at the bottom of the box. One, flipped face down, had writing covering the back in frantic script. You must still love me. You must still love me. The next bore a photo of Isabel, clearly distressed, standing against a wooden wall, possibly the interior of the same cottage Julian had come from. Ramirez said nothing, but her jaw clenched as she flipped through them. On the back of one, Julian had written a full paragraph, words that spiraled from desperation to confession. Graham couldn't read it all, but he caught a few phrases. She said she didn't want to hide anymore. I told her we could make it real. She kept talking about Brandon, like he was her escape. I couldn't let her leave me. Ramirez set the last one down carefully. Was that it? Graham asked. Not quite, another officer said. We found disturbed ground about 15 feet from here. Different soil composition. We think it may be her. Graham's legs gave out. He sank to the grass, staring at nothing, hearing only the waves. Somewhere between hope and horror, he sat and waited as the forensic team began excavation. The sun slipped lower. The light turned amber, soft like a whisper. And then, confirmation. Bone fragments, clothing fibers, a shoe, a single, delicate bracelet, silver, with a charm shaped like a starfish. Graham recognized it instantly. I gave that to her, he said, hollow, on her 17th birthday. Detective Ramirez came to him, crouched beside him. Would you like us to contact your wife? He nodded, his voice gone. And Marianne Bell, too, he added after a moment. She loved her like a sister. She deserves to know. By the time Judith arrived, an hour had passed. She stepped out of the car and walked straight to Graham without a word. He stood, and they collapsed into each other. No sobs, just the weight of breath shared between two people who had held grief apart for too long. Ramirez gave them space. When Marianne arrived, her face was streaked with tears, even before she spoke. I didn't know, she whispered to Graham. I should have known. You were just a girl, too, Judith said, pulling her close. This isn't on you. The three of them stood at the edge of the taped perimeter, watching as a life, long hidden, finally began to surface. Graham's eyes locked on the wooden box, now placed beside the skeletal remains. Two things buried years apart, side by side, a confession, and the one it failed to silence. He felt something new then, not closure, not yet, but the first real breath he'd taken in 22 years. The wind shifted. The sea roared just a little louder. Somewhere deep in that sound, he thought he heard her voice again, stronger than before. The ocean was calm that morning, unusually so, as if it too had been holding something for 22 years and was finally ready to let it go. Off the coast of Mornington, a small procession of boats glided across the water in quiet formation. The lead vessel cut through the surface slowly, deliberately, its bow pointed toward the horizon, like a compass led by grief and grace. On board stood Graham Porter, hands wrapped around a smooth silver urn. Beside him, Judith, her hand resting on his arm. And not far behind, Marianne Bell, clutching a worn book pressed to her chest. The secret garden, its corners frayed, its pages heavy with time. In the boats that followed, classmates, neighbors, even a few old teachers who still remembered Isabel's smile in the school hallways. There was no music, just the wind, the waves, and the kind of silence people only keep when they're standing next to something sacred. They reached the spot near Whitlow Cliff, where the sea met the sky in a seamless blur, where Isabel had once said she felt most alive. A local minister stepped forward. He didn't need a microphone. His voice, like the moment, didn't require volume, only presence. Today, he said, we say goodbye, not to a mystery, but to a girl we've loved for more years than she lived. Isabel Porter left our world too soon, but not our hearts. For 22 years, we carried her absence like a stone. Today, we return her to the place she loved, not to erase what we lost, but to honor what we still carry. Judith stepped forward. Her voice was soft but clear. She wanted to be a marine biologist, she said. She told us once, when she was 15, that the ocean felt like a library full of secrets, and she wanted to read every page. Graham looked down at the urn in his hands. He had imagined this moment in 1,000 different ways. In dreams, in nightmares, in quiet hours between sleep and sunrise. But none of them ever felt like this, real and still impossible. He opened the lid. Ashes don't look like a person, but they hold everything you once held in your arms. He stepped to the edge of the boat, the wind catching in his coat, and slowly released the contents into the sea. They drifted down in soft spirals, mingling with the salt and light. Judith took a handful of white hyacinths, fresh, fragrant, and scattered them after. One by one, others followed suit. Soon the ocean was blanketed in a garden of white petals, bobbing gently in the current. Marianne stepped up last. Her hands shook as she kissed the cover of the book and placed it on the water's surface. It floated for a moment, pages fluttering in the breeze, like fingers waving goodbye. Then slowly, it sank, carrying with it a promise unkept, a friendship paused in time. "Goodbye, Izzy," Marianne whispered. I'm sorry I never returned your book. No one spoke after that. They didn't have to. The boats turned and began drifting back to shore, a slow parade of closure. Graham remained at the bow, staring at the last of the flowers until they disappeared behind the waves. On the ride back, Detective Ramirez approached the family quietly. He confessed, she said. We've got it all on record. Graham nodded, his grip tightening on the railing. Ramirez continued, gently. He said they were in the cottage for 3 days, that he thought he could convince her to stay, to start over. But when she told him she'd already chosen to leave, that she was going to tell everyone the truth, something in him snapped. He said she tried to run. He said she fought back. Judith closed her eyes. He said he didn't mean to, at first, Ramirez went on. But once it was done, he told himself she deserved it for giving up on him. He buried her, hid everything, lived his life like it never happened. Graham looked out at the sea again. He buried her, then buried himself in success. Ramirez nodded, and no one ever looked his way, because he didn't have a record, because she didn't tell anyone, because she believed he could change. She always did, Judith whispered. She thought love could fix things. She thought she could fix him, Graham added, barely audible. Ramirez paused, then said, You should know. When we recovered that cassette from the box, the one she recorded, we managed to restore part of it. Graham turned to her, eyes narrowing. She talks, Ramirez said, to someone, maybe to herself, maybe to you. She says she's sorry for not telling you, that she thought if she handled it alone, you and Judith wouldn't worry, that she was wrong. Judith's face crumpled. She says, Ramirez added softly, that if this message ever made it to you, it meant someone didn't let her disappear, that someone still remembered. Graham wiped his face roughly. She left a voice behind. She left strength, Ramirez corrected. Even at the end, she left hope. Back on land, the air felt different, lighter, like the pressure in Graham's lungs had finally shifted, allowing breath to come without effort. The clouds had cleared, the mist retreating as if even the weather knew a story had just closed. That evening, Graham and Judith sat on their back porch, wrapped in silence that no longer crushed them. Between them, on the little table, was a framed photo. Not Isabel's senior portrait, but a candid one. She was laughing, hair blown wildly by the wind, eyes squinted at the sun, pure, alive, defiant. Judith poured 2 cups of tea. Her hands no longer shook. We can move forward now, she said quietly. Not by forgetting, but by remembering the right way. Graham reached for her hand. She was so much like you. That instinct to help people, even the broken ones. And she had your stubbornness, Judith replied, with a sad smile. Once she believed in someone, nothing could change her mind. They sat there a while longer, watching the stars appear one by one. I keep thinking about how young she was, Graham said. She believed in love, in redemption, in making broken things whole. Judith nodded. It's not a bad thing to believe in. The world could use more of it. But sometimes, it takes more than love. Sometimes, love needs witnesses. He looked up at the night sky. She has them now. Judith squeezed his hand. And she's not missing anymore. Not lost, not a question mark. No, Graham said. She's a name a story, a sea. The wind stirred again, and in that hush between the trees and the waves, Graham heard something he hadn't heard in 2 decades. Peace.